Well, good afternoon. Hello, Luke. This
Hello.
is Kurt Doolittle from the Natural Law Institute, Institute of Natural Law, the Natural Law Institute, whatever it
Natural
is.
Law Institute. Yeah.
Whatever,
That's the way we've been running
who
it.
do we work for again?
We work for the people.
That's right. That's right. Doesn't matter. All right. So we've been going through your book, and today we're going to cover chapter 15, which is about fear, which I find fascinating. Now, there's only 16 chapters in the book, so we've gone today. There's only one left after this one.
Correct.
So could you tell me what you're trying to get across in this? Oh, excuse me, there's the book. Sorry. I forgot. I skipped a step.
All
Show
right,
us
I got
the
you.
Primal Primer.
Primal Primer. That's the book. That's
All right,
what
so
we're talking about today.
we're on chapter 15. What are you trying to get across in this chapter, and how does it fit into the overall structure of the book?
Right. So chapter 15 is called The Fear Factor, Harnessing the Essential Negative Emotion. Right. And the reason this is in here, the goal of this chapter specifically is to get people to stop being afraid of fear. Right. And that probably doesn't sound like a sentence that makes a lot of sense because I'm using the term to define the term. Right. But the reason this is in here is one of the pieces of feedback I get from a lot of people that are completely unfamiliar with any of the stuff I'm talking about when I first start talking to them about it is, won't this situational awareness stuff specifically make me walk around all the time fearful? Because now I'm hyper aware of the potential for all these threats in my environments.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, that was just feedback to me that said it was important for me to help people figure out how to understand and then manage what fear is. Right. So that's through the interacting with people about this, it just became an essential part of teaching them situational awareness, is how to navigate the fear aspect of situational awareness. Right. So that's why. So yeah, go ahead.
So why isn't it the first chapter in the book?
Because situational awareness works whether you understand this piece or not. This piece just helps you get more comfortable with it and achieve more mastery of it.
That's true, but I'm sorry, I just want to explore this because I found an interesting way to reinforce your idea.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But what's your goal? Why do you want to give people the primal primer? I mean, what's your objective here? You could say it's to teach situational awareness. Situational awareness is a means to an end.
It is.
What's the end you're trying to get people to? I mean, I know what it is, but I want you to enumerate it for the audience.
Sure. And it's a consistent theme throughout the book. The purpose of all of this stuff, all the material in here, is for some people, it's to introduce the option or the opportunity for cooperation. But for most people, it's going to be to preserve the potential for cooperation. Right. And the reason I say that, the reason I take this approach to getting there is that cooperation has to be a choice. Right. That's one of the requirements for it to meet the standard of the phenomenon we call cooperation, or the behavior we call cooperation. If you're being compelled to do it, if you're being forced to do it, if somebody has a gun to your head, then your compliance with them is not cooperation. Right. I think that's fairly easy to recognize. Right. But we don't pay attention to that in our daily interactions. Right. We don't pay attention to all the forces of compulsion that are being applied to us. We walk around thinking ourselves cooperating with all of the systems we engage with all the institutions we engage with all the individuals we interact with. Right. And so what I'm trying to help people see is that a lot of us are in a state where what we're calling cooperation isn't cooperation.
That's right.
And I want to fix that.
I
don't want to fix that by changing anything that's external to you.
Yeah.
I want to fix that by
let
changing.
Let me jump in again. Is that so? Traditionally, that's the goal, right?
Yes.
But you're trying to overcome two things, as far as I understand, right? You're trying, you're trying. What I consider is producing mindfulness, because you've produced agency.
Right.
So I have agency. In other words, I have self-determination. Therefore, I have the capacity to produce self-determination.
Yes.
I have mindfulness because of it. And therefore, I can understand my circumstance, and I can choose to cooperate or not.
Right.
or resist cooperation or produce alternative cooperation.
Right.
So the converse is, what if you don't have the agency to have the mindfulness to be able to produce the cooperation, the choice of determination and cooperation, right? Is fear.
Right.
Right. So I'm like, because all through the book, I'm sitting there asking you the question you just proposed, right? Which is, but some idiot's gonna, excuse me, some well-intentioned person is gonna read this and say, I don't want to be fearful. You're like saying, no, the point is you won't be.
Yeah. Well, and that, that's one of the reasons I had to put the topic of fear later in the book, is because the argument I make and how I present fear itself is, it is a foundation of competence that provides you the confidence, that provides you access to the confidence, right? And it's that confidence that acts as a counter to the fear.
That gives
so
you
I had to provide the reader that foundation of competence before we even talk about fear, so that when they get to this point, they have that foundation in place, and all they have to do is drop fear on top of that foundation.
Yes.
And it'll
So can I compliment you again?
Yeah.
So one of the things, of course, I know Luke for quite a while now, so a long time now. But so there's the book reads a little bit like, because you had to do it, right? I mean, you frame the book so it appeals to the competency. What do you call it? This what do you call it? The field you're in. What's the field you're in again?
The situational awareness.
Situational awareness.
Yeah,
so you framed it as situational awareness.
Yeah.
But it's actually much deeper book than that.
Yes.
Right. And so
don't tell anyone.
Well, I know that's no, but it's what I find fascinating. There's a much deeper thing going on that he's trying to get across, which is this piece. And and so when I looked at your book originally, I'm like, when you first told me about it, I'm like, I don't get it. And it's like, yeah, he's like, I know, Kurt, you're dim. You'll figure it out, right? And so so he comes out with it, and I read it, and I'm like, oh shit, this is brilliant. And now going through it with you, I'm like, oh, it's way deeper than I thought. It's quite good. So anyway, so it's just fascinating to me that the philosophical structure, or the scientific structure, the social science that you're putting in place here, the behavioral science that you're depending on, is quite sophisticated, and you're just finding a way to reach people with the applied method.
God, right? I hope so. That's the aim, right? Because all of that is sitting behind it, right? But if you throw all that at the type of reader that I'm trying to reach, none of it's going to land.
No, I understand. I get. I totally. That's why I said it's brilliant. But it's just interesting to me, like, because I work at the abstract level, right? That's what I work at. But you've brought it down and said, okay, you don't have to understand any of that. I'm going to give you the recipe for producing it.
Yes. Right.
And I just think it's brilliant. So anyway, so that's my compliment. I'll stop fawning. Anyway, so let's go over. So go ahead.
No, that's good. And it's again, it's why I organize the material in the way I organize. There's thought behind all of this. None of this is just, I didn't slap anything into place, right? I mean, I went looking for specific pieces to put in specific places throughout this entire book. As simple as the book, the simplicity of the book is intentional.
Yeah, it's also slightly misleading,
right?
Because it's way more sophisticated than it appears.
Right. Yeah, well, and that's that's the
like military indoctrination, right? You have no idea what's going on, but the sophistication of what they're doing to you is actually profound.
Well, the flip side though is that so much of what I'm presenting, so much of what I'm trying to draw from, is evolved. It's inherent to being human. We've just let it atrophy. We've distanced ourselves from it. So it's not that even that I'm trying to introduce something to you that's not already a part of you.
Yeah,
I'm just trying to give you back something that you already give you back access to something that you already possess.
Yes, yes.
But that's been denied to you, or that access has been denied to you because you never had somebody introduce it to you. Right. So I mean, all the situational awareness stuff, the being able to navigate your environment and stuff like that, this is just stuff humans did from the time we stood up.
Mhm.
Right. So it's not like I'm reaching out for some obscure
So you're saying
concepts.
that disconnect is a real serious problem. It's the problem.
Absolutely. It's an enormous problem.
Yeah. All right. So this is chapter 15, harnessing the essential negative emotion.
Right.
All right.
Yeah.
So walk me through how you want to get this message across, this bit
Sure.
of wisdom across.
So that I open the chapter with a very vivid memory I have of childhood, and this is a very early childhood. It's like the only memory I have of my early childhood, and it's a fear-based memory, very, but it's stuck with me since then because of, I mean, that's how much impact it had. Right, I had to be 3, maybe 4 years old, right, at the time, and my brother and I, we had bunk beds, right, and I was on the top bunk, right, but there was it was like a teddy bear on a shelf or something like that, right, but it was dark out, right, and I had woken up in the middle of the night, and all I saw was this shadow, and it scared the absolute piss out of me, right? To the point where I couldn't move and I couldn't speak. And it wasn't a choice. It wasn't like I went through a thought process of, hey, that's really scary. My body should respond to that thing that's really scary. It just happened, right? Fear took
I've
over.
done this to girls with snakes.
Right. Yeah, it's that same kind of thing. But what, most people are, at least the conditioning that we get from society, would look at that and go, that's a weakness response.
Yes,
Right.
That's right.
That's a problem response. That's not, though. That's not the case, right? If this was a natural environment and I was that 3-year-old and I came across the snake that was a lethal threat to me, any movement and any sound would have alerted that snake to my presence.
Mm-hmm.
So the fear shut down movement and shut down sound and kept me alive.
That's right.
Right. And so that the reason I use that example is because I want people to recognize that the things that fear offers us aren't negatives. The things that
It's
fear
just
offers
information.
us,
It's
right?
just
It's
information.
just a
It's either
signal,
good information or bad, but it's
right?
information.
Well, and even that, and that's one of the things I get into in this chapter is we have a confused perception of what emotions are because they come to us in a couple different states, right? There's emotions as the signal, which for my frame is the important stuff. And then there's emotions as the cognitive projection onto those signals.
Yes.
Right. Which is how we express ourselves and how we interact emotionally. Right. But people don't keep that distinction alive in their minds when they're thinking about emotions or they're figuring out how to. Right. We overgeneralize. Right. And so one of the important aspects I want people to take away from this chapter specifically when it comes to fear, but when it comes to emotions in general, is that we need that fear signal in order to effectively and safely navigate our environments, right? We don't necessarily need the projection part that we lay on top of, but we need the fear signal. People talk about stoicism, right? And they have this confused ideal of stoicism as being the absence of emotional response, right? And not everybody, right? But a lot of people I interact with that pursue stoicism as an ideal pursue it with the understanding that means they're going to have an absence of an emotional response to things, right? And from my mind, that's hugely crippling. That's like a fighter pilot being in a hostile war zone, turning off their radar and turning off their comms.
It means you can. If it means you have no emotion, you're screwed up.
Right.
What it means is you can observe those emotions and determine whether they're how to respond to them, which is what you've already stated.
Right.
The difference between the signal and the response. Right.
Yes, absolutely. So that's kind of the big thrusts I take in this chapter, right? And I go through different steps to try to present those distinctions and try to provide that clarity to the reader, right? So that fear, well, and I understand it and I agree. Fear doesn't feel good, right? But I want people to recognize fear is a tool for us, right? And it's that misperception about fear that's fueling a lot of our inappropriate anxiety. today, right? And one of my, one of my subtopics for the book, one of my, the subheading is slay anxiety, right? That's part of this process of doing that is rebuilding or reestablishing people's healthy relationship with fear,
reality. Yes.
right?
How do
And if they don't have a relationship, it's a healthy one, right? So that's why the next section is your relationship with fear. Right? That's the next thing I get into after my introduction and after
can we get sex out of this somehow?
That's what this is
you
all
brought up
about,
the word
right?
relationship, and I went to where my normal cognition would be.
For some of us, that's a consistent theme in our choice of partners is a relationship with fear, right?
I wasn't sure how you're going to spin that, but that was good. All right. So your relationship with fear. What does this mean?
Right. So in this section, I start to describe for the reader what we've been talking about, their false relationship with fear, how it's been used, and that creates vulnerability. We talk about vulnerability a lot in this book because the more dependent you are, the more vulnerable you are to whoever is supplying the needs that meet your dependencies, right? And that same thing happens for fear, right? If you have a terrible or an unhealthy relationship with fear, then that becomes a strong lever of manipulation to use against you. Anything that can trigger your fear or your perception of fear can use that to exert control over you, right? And so that's one of the things I start describing in this section called your relationship with fear, right? So specifically, how those entrusted with the development of their parents, their teachers, the politicians that run their schools, things like that, they haven't really instructed them how to navigate fear, how to
I see.
explore fear.
Oh God, that's so horrible. You didn't need to tell me that. That ruined my day because I just put a whole new color on the problem with education.
Yeah. And that's
Holy
that's another consistent theme throughout the book here is that this stuff was just it's a failure of proper instruction. A lot of this stuff is just a failure of proper instruction. Yeah.
Don't ruin my day like this. We got enough people on the team that come up with these painful truths that let us realize how horribly screwed we are.
Well, that's the thing, so much of what we explore is the active things that are done to people to infantilize them or to undermine them or whatever. But a lot of what happens, and a lot of its good intention, is what fails to be provided to the individual. Like the training that gets failed to be provided, the instruction that gets failed to be provided. That if your parents themselves have absolutely no idea, no capacity how to have a healthy relationship with fear, they can't model it for you. And if you have no teachers that have a healthy relationship with fear, they can't model it for you. So we have generations of people out there walking around never having been modeled how to have a healthy relationship with fear or any of the other emotional signals that are essential to our successful navigation of our environments.
Yeah, it's this whole everybody gets a prize thing is a freaking
exactly.
Despite that Taleb doesn't like me very much because of my just criticism of him, his whole thing of anti-fragility is actually correct.
Right.
The more stresses you put a thing under, the thing is, what is the stress we can take you to without harming you?
Right.
Like physically harming you that prevents you from adapting to even greater stresses. Right. And so what you're saying is we're not subjecting people to healthy stresses.
Correct. Yeah. And that's kind of the thesis of the entire book. And the thesis of all the work that I do is that we need to be exposed to healthy stressors in order to optimize our adaptations as humans. Mm-hmm. Right. And we're missing out on a lot of that. That's why I use the gym as an example, right? We understand that in that specific frame, but for whatever reason, we can't make the cognitive leap to all the other dynamics that make a human. Right. Yeah.
Fundamentally, what do Buddhism and Stoicism do?
Right.
They're basically the gym for you looking at your emotions and saying, yeah, does this matter?
Yes.
Right. Yeah. And what you're saying is, if you don't have that, you're stuck with fear.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. And if you have no way to process fear, you're stuck in a perpetual state of anxiety.
Yes.
And that's the fastest growing mental health issue in the West right now.
Yeah.
So clearly it's not being addressed. So that's why one of the aims with this whole body of work is to address that specific issue, because clearly it's not being addressed. And we have my children's peers are suffering because nobody is teaching them this stuff. And I don't want my children to grow up with a peer group that's completely dysfunctional.
I have millennial children.
Yeah,
right?
I do too.
And they're nowhere, that's one thing, but the Gen Z kids, it's a crime what's been done to them. I
Yeah.
mean, half of them are from traditional families who've taught them, but the other half is a basket case.
Yeah.
I don't know what that half consists of, but you can tell it by talking to them for 15 seconds, not
Right.
even 10
Right.
seconds.
Right.
They're a mess.
But that, that's also what keeps me in a place where I can offer a lot of compassion to these cohorts.
Yes, yes.
Right. Because I recognize that no one has been honest with them about fear. So how it's impossible then for them to be acting in a state where they have a healthy relationship with fear, right? I can't expect that of them.
Mm-hmm.
Right. To do so would be me introducing a harm to have that expectation of them. Right. So that's, that's one of the reasons I'm able to do the stuff that I do, is because I have that, that compassion for the state they're in, because I can see how we got there.
It's because, you were cursed with being a moral man,
Well,
you could have been an immoral man and not had this problem.
this stuff is super easy to exploit, and because I can see all the patterns, I can easily see how to exploit all of this stuff. Right.
Yep.
That's one of the things I'm hoping to
Work
head
against.
off for people.
Yes.
Yeah. So signal versus emotion. That's the next section of the book, right? So fear is a signal response, right? And most of us, just because, again, nobody's walking us through it, have spent very little time exposed to genuine fear as a signal, right? We spend a lot of time with the concept of fear and our projections onto what that concept means, but we spend very little time exposed to fear triggers, right? So instead, we spend time on, the way I phrase it is, we spend time focused on the anticipation of the fear signal rather than the fear signal itself.
Right. In other words,
makes sense.
So feeling uncertainty about your ability to understand and navigate the world,
right,
or respond to it, that you're in a constant state of stress, which produces this constant state of anxiety, which
right.
Okay.
So
I'm just going to keep up with you, man.
Yeah. And the word I use to describe that is you're in a state of dreading fear, right? And that we use a lot of words to describe fear. Most of them aren't actually describing fear. They're describing our states in how we're perceiving fear. Like the anticipation of fear, I call dread, right? Because it's not an actual fear response.
What's depression? It's exhaustion.
Right.
From the inability to solve a problem.
Well, being overwhelmed by,
right.
It's a state of overwhelm.
Exactly.
That people find themselves consistently.
I don't know why it took us so long to figure that out. It wasn't freaking complicated. I'm just
right. None of
your
this
brain is tired
once you see it, right? So
yes.
So using that idea that I use the word dread to describe the anticipation of fear, I introduce the reader to what I call the fear scale, right? And I use it to articulate the distinction between fear, the signal, and then all the things that we're calling fear, all the emotional states that we're calling fear, right? So fear as a signal only ever produces an active response. Fear as a signal only ever produces fight, flight, or freeze. Right? Fear as a signal.
Hold on. I want to test that.
Yeah.
Well, because I'm not normal.
Right.
We talked before, but I have an unhealthy fear response. Like I don't have enough.
Right.
My response to fear is aggression.
Right.
Right. Is that include?
Where does that?
Oh, I see. Okay. So so your fear scale doesn't include the other dimension.
No.
Right.
The fear scale is not the fear signal scale. It's just the fear signal scale is fight, flight, and freeze.
Got it.
But I'm introducing this because that's how you can tell whether you're responding to a signal or you're responding to your attention, your anticipation of fear, or a projection of fear. Right? If it's a signal that you're responding to, you are experiencing fight, flight, or freeze.
Right.
And that's how you know if you're responding to a signal. If it's not triggering action in the form of fight, flight, or freeze, then you're not responding to a fear signal. You're responding to the emotion of fear, but you're responding to it as a concept. You're responding to the projection you're applying, the meaning you're adding to the signal of fear. Right? So you've already missed the opportunity for fight, flight, and freeze if you're in one of these other emotional states about it. Right? Or it's a perpetual thing the signal is perpetual and it's continuously being introduced to you and you haven't addressed it yet. Right? So the fight, flight, and freeze, it's what I call productive fear, right? Because it's driving an action. It's driving you to choose safety, whether you have the training to recognize fight, flight, or freeze, which of those options is the best option for safety. It's not what I'm talking about here, but the fear signal itself, productive fear, is driving you to take an action that results in increasing your safety, right? That's what fight, flight, or freeze does. So, but fear is the emotion, fear is the projection, is a disruptive fear, and it can overwhelm you in the form of panic. It can manifest as any of the lesser states below panic, such as, and this is where the scale comes in, is dread, fright, anxiety, apprehension, worry, doubt, or concern. Right? Those are and of course, there's infinite numbers of degrees inside each one of these, just to give the reader kind of a frame to work from. If they're in those states, if that's how they would describe what they're calling fear, then what they're talking about is an anticipation or projection about the fear signal rather than the fear signal itself, right? And again, the reason that this is important is just so people can start to utilize an accurate fear signal. They can recognize the fear signal itself and utilize it in
disambiguation by serialization and
right.
operationalization
Yes.
to give people a system of measurement so they can look at themselves and have a rational framework for understanding their emotions.
Right. And I want people to do that, because when you get that fear spike, which is that productive fear that's just triggering an action, you need to identify what the source of that spike is. Where's that signal coming from?
What's the source and how? And yeah, exactly.
Right. And that's what all the situational awareness stuff is. Right. So you have the tools to do that.
Well, the other thing, I mean, I'm a big fan of your work, right? I mean, because I didn't really understand how profound it was. I mean, it's partly the wonder that I've got out of it that's it made me. But what you're saying though is if I have all these things, fear, I habituate being confident,
right?
Because I know what's going on.
Yes.
And so I won't. If I have a fear signal, it'll be rare.
Right.
I mean, that's what you're saying.
And it'll
be
accurate.
And it'll be accurate.
You're going to be good at identifying which is a valid fear signal and which is a false fear signal.
Right.
Going back to the radar analogy, right? Is it useful for the pilot to freak out when the red dot shows up on his radar? Or is that just information?
It's better to know that than not know it.
Right. And is it useful for the pilot to be able to differentiate between a red dot and a green dot? Or should he respond the same to all dots on the radar?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? We want to be good at recognizing that the dot is information for us, and that we can tell the difference between useful information and not useful information, right? That's all these signals are doing for us.
Yes.
Right. Yes. So that's why some of this stuff becomes important, right? And I do caveat that this fear scale here that is demonstrative, not exhaustive, right? We have a lot of stories we tell ourselves about fear, so it can show up in a lot of different ways. But I just want people to understand that there's some structure to how we flow ourselves through it with the projections of fear, right?
Frank Herbert's really simple. Back in the 60s, I remember the first time I read it in Dune. It was like, fear is the mind killer, and isn't there? It's about as simple as you can get.
Yes.
And so you want to keep your mind, you need to have as much agency as possible.
Yeah.
By being aware, being conscious, or situationally aware, is this opportunity for fear?
Yeah. Is this a signal, or is this me projecting onto
right
how I'm interpreting the signal? Right. Mm-hmm. And I harp on that a lot in this chapter, because the more we respond to the anticipation of fear, the more we're compromising our ability to accurately receive a fear signal.
Correct.
Right. We're fooling ourselves to thinking this is, and it can get to the point where we actually start to convince our body that this is a legitimate fear, rather than a projection onto a fear signal. Right. Mm-hmm. And what that does is it interferes with our ability to accurately receive fear signals from our environment. Right. It's a fear signal produced internally rather than a fear signal from the environment. And we need to learn how to recognize that difference so that we can accurately receive those fear signals from our environment. Because that's what keeps us safe. Is when something in our environment triggers that fear signal, gives off that fear signal, we know to respond to it. We know to step into action to allow that fight, flight, or freeze response to trigger. If we're in violent encounter, going back to this idea that we have to get rid of fear entirely, right? If we're in a violent encounter, we want fear to be in control of that autonomic nervous system because we want that adrenaline dump so that we can fight off the attacker. We want that cortisol dump so that vasoconstriction occurs and our body's protecting our internal organs and our brain. We want that dopamine dump because we want to be able to keep fighting even if we're injured or hurt or pain is introduced. We want all of those things that are triggered by fear being in charge of our autonomic nervous system, right? We want fear in control in the beginning of a violent encounter if we want to survive that violent encounter. So this notion that we want to never have our emotions in control of us is counterproductive to our survival. What we don't want is our meaning making, our projections onto those emotions to be controlling us, right? So that's why it's important to make a distinction between those two forms that emotions take. And, I would apply that to all emotions, not just fear. It's important for fear for the purposes of what I'm teaching in the book, but that I believe that this same dynamic exists for all emotions. They're signals if they're productive, and then we have a lot of meaning and anticipations and projections that we apply to them, and that's a different experience of the emotion, right? And so if we can get good at interpreting the signal of the emotion, then we can navigate even our positive interactions a lot more competently because we're just reading the signals, right? Instead of all of our projections onto them. So that's why I get into that piece there. The next section, what fear really is, right? And this opens up with some wisdom acronyms, some common wisdom acronyms, and some people have heard one of these. I use a couple of different ones in here.
It's your body preparing itself. It's your mind telling your body to prepare itself for fight or flight.
Yeah,
which is not good for it.
No. If it's inappropriate, right? We want the body prepared for fight or flight when there's an actual fear trigger. When there's actually a threat.
Sorry, I should have said the obvious and was instead of something so blatantly foolish, but
so what fear really is, right? So this next one opens up with some common acronyms that we hear for fear, right? Where each letter represents a word, right? So false evidence appearing real. The 4 letters of fear can be described as that. The next one is false expectations appearing real, right? And those are both useful acronyms to keep in mind, right? Because this conveys the idea that it's not the fear signal itself that we're responding to with these forms of fear. It is the false evidence that we're responding to. It is the false expectations. It's like when you walk in to a room and you get a fear spike and you look at who's in the room and you see, the guy with the tank top on with the bulging muscles and the tattoos everywhere. And, maybe that is the source of the fear spike, but we start falsely applying expectations to that scenario. It might be the kid in the corner with the hoodie on, and we recognize the bulge in his pocket that actually triggered the fear signal that we're not being aware of. But we're paying attention to the guy with the bulging muscles and the tank top and the tattoo because we have the false expectation that guy represents a threat. So now we're ignoring the fear signal in the room and instead applying our fear projection using false expectations, right? And so that's what I'm talking about when I say we start missing the actual fear signal because we're applying our projections instead of paying attention to the signal itself, right? So that's why I wanted to make sure that these were in here because these are accurate, these are true, but we also need to keep in mind that the false part of that false evidence appearing real, false expectations appearing real, the false part of that may also be deceiving, right? We may look at that room and have that false expectation, but that doesn't mean that the situation won't change quickly so that what we were picking up on actually becomes a threat to us, right? So we don't want to dismiss either side of that. We don't want to dismiss the signal, and we don't want to dismiss our assessments, our cues that we've learned to pick up on either, right? So we want to use fear as a tool to trigger the other tools that we have available to us. The situational awareness, behavioral analysis, so the atmospherics, the proxemics, the kinesics, the biometrics, right? So the signal should be an initiation of those other tools that we have available to us, right? So that we're not stuck in that fear response, so that we're not stuck in the fear taking over our executive function, right? We want the fear to trigger the autonomic nervous system, and then we want to take back control and apply the other tools that we have, right? If that makes sense. So you don't want to overly commit to the source of our fear being false either. Anytime we have a fear spike, anytime we receive a fear signal, something triggered it. And it's important to be able to accurately identify what triggered that fear spike, right? That's kind of the gist of that section. The title of the next section is called "Not All the Same," right? And again, just talking about how fear shows up differently for us. There's different forms that fear takes or emotions take. So much of our social conditioning exists in order for people to evade fear. Like you mentioned earlier, the participation trophies and things like that, right? We do a lot, and where we should be teaching our kids and teaching each other how to navigate fear. Instead, we introduce ways to avoid the experience of fear.
I was like, we're teaching resilience. No, you're teaching evasion.
Right.
You're teaching evasion. You're not teaching
evasion.
competency.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Right. Yeah, and that's that's enormously detrimental to us long term. It may feel good in that moment. It may help.
Being lazy feels good.
Yeah. Right.
Right. I mean, it's not good for you.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
Doing homework doesn't feel good. I'm sorry. It's good for you.
Right. But that, and that, it gets back to what I was talking about earlier. We're asking people that have a poor relationship with fear to teach our children how to build a healthy relationship with fear. And that's a failed proposition. It's an impossible thing to achieve using that combination, right? So we really have to rethink how we're exploring these topics and how we're trading these topics. And we need to introduce them way earlier, right? I mean, my 4-year-old gets exposed to things that scare her. Not because I want her walking around scared, but because I'm right there and I can help her navigate. Right.
Are you the scary thing?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. But I don't want my kid completely unequipped if she's playing in the backyard and a snake comes out of the grass. I don't want her response to be panic, which triggers the animal to attack, right? I want her to know, either stand still or get out of there if you can, or attack the animal if you need to, right? Yes. I mean, I want her equipped to all of those responses to the fear signal, that the threat that it entered her environment, right? Even if I'm not right there, I let my kids play in the backyard without me being right there often. So I want them equipped to navigate that environment. Yeah. So, in a lot of ways, one of the ways I'm working kind of uphill with this material is we're actually conditioned and warned against learning a lot of the things that I set out to teach in the book.
So explain that some, because that
we don't want to be confronted with fear.
That bothers me.
We don't want to be confronted with fear, and a lot of what I introduce to people is situational awareness. I'm telling you, threats exist in your environment. You need to be aware of them. Whereas everybody else, the conditioning is there aren't threats in your environment. You need to trust everybody. Don't judge people. Don't look at people different from one another. Treat everybody the same. Right. Whereas I'm teaching, no, judge everything in your environment. Be on the lookout for threats. If something feels off, pay attention to that. If something's triggering your fear, identify what it is. Judge the environment that you're in until you can figure out what is triggering your fear. Right. So I'm actually working against the common narrative with a lot of the material in the book. Right. But almost all of that conditioning, almost all of that narrative is trying to allow people to avoid being confronted with fear.
Okay, so can I contextualize this a little bit?
Sure. Yeah.
So the West is a high trust society. So we used to put all these institutions in place to push people into responsibility for self-regulation, so that we could have a high trust society.
Yes.
So that we could trust each other.
Yes.
What they're saying is, I'm not going to make you do all that responsibility stuff, all that agency stuff, all that respect stuff, and all that suppression of self-interest stuff. I'm not going to make you do that. And you should just trust people like magic.
Right. Yes.
Which doesn't work.
No,
it's the opposite of so it's like asking for the magic to happen.
Yes.
So it's like, how do you phrase it here? You say, not all this. You say it's something about you put it in here. If anybody wonders why I keep looking up, it's because Luke's notes are in the video. I have the screen above my monitor. So when I look at this, I'm like, well, it's like magical thinking. Let's not only deny these threats exist, but let's take away the thing that makes it possible for them not to.
Right. Yes. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Isn't it insane?
It is. It is. And it stems from taking for granted that high trust, right? Without being able to recognize all of those mechanisms
and magical thinking.
Produce. Right. Yeah. That produce the high. That's what the magical thinking is. It's like high
Yes,
trust just exists. We can just tell people to trust each other.
A norm
that's
is
what
like gravity, right? No,
Right, yeah.
we have institutions that are unique in human history that produce that norm.
Right.
There's only
Yes.
one group of people, the Japanese, even close to us.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And my argument is a healthy relationship with fear is one of those mechanisms that affords us the opportunity for high trust. Right. And it's that unhealthy relationship that undermines it.
The 27, I will bring this up, I use this. The 27 words for snow among us, it's not actually true, right? I mean, it's like they have 27 phrases, right? Right. So, but I think in English history, right? Because I'm from it's not present in America like it used to be, but when I was growing up, it was, and certainly in my parents' generation before it was present, is we have like 9 million ways to talk about tricks. Right, but it's or tricks or intelligence jokes or being dim, right? You know why? Is it's so we can inoculate you. What's Pinocchio? It's inoculation. What's Snow White? It's inoculation. What is this goofy humor we have? It's inoculation. What is trash talking? It's inoculation. Right.
And those are all the things being removed from the narrative because they might hurt people's feelings. They might make people afraid.
Let's go up with what your feeling is. What's their feeling? Their feeling is they don't want to adapt. They don't want to learn. Yes. They don't want to be responsible. Except the high trust we live in is because we're forcing you to be responsible so you learn to adapt. Right? That's what the high trust comes out of. It's exasperating.
It is. I
don't know why you just don't. I mean, how do you do what you do without wanting to run around and just smack people? I mean, I know you're a moral man, you're kind and sweet and all, but I mean, I'd get exasperated.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the thing that exasperates me most is seeing people pay for their own undermining. Right? We keep investing in all these things that are killing us. It's like. We got to stop doing that.
That's something. If I could change one thing in the discourse, it's not we. It's them.
Right.
There's just a lot of them.
Right.
All right.
For the next section I get into,
I screwed up your train of thought well enough.
No, it's fine.
Okay, because I thought I did a good job of trying there.
No, you're good. The thing is, all the things you're describing, if you dig down through the layers of them, they're all rooted in that unhealthy relationship with fear. Right. Like the avoidance of responsibility. That's a fear response.
That's a fear response.
I don't have the competence to accept responsibility, so I have to avoid it.
Yes.
I can't deal with the consequences of failure in that situation or in that demand or in that duty. So I have to avoid it. I have to find a way to get out from underneath it. I have to escape it. And that's a fear response. That's an unhealthy fear response. And it's a demonstration of a lack of foundational competence.
Yes.
Right. So a lot of this stuff that we're seeing, and that's why anxiety is such a huge issue, because that's how this, I call it the slow drip of anxiety is what everybody is experiencing, because we're not being hunted by dinosaurs. We're not being hunted by saber-toothed tigers. It's not spikes of fear. It's not spikes of anxiety. It's this low scale continuous drip of anxiety produced by our inability to navigate our environments at all. Right. But that means we're under a constant fear pressure that we have no capacity to navigate. We've never been taught how to navigate it. We don't even know how to recognize it as a fear state, right? Because we're so far removed from instruction on how to have a healthy relationship with fear, right? So anxiety is everywhere. And there's entire industries now making billions of dollars off of treating this thing that's just rooted in building a healthy relationship with fear. It's like,
It's insane. It's insane. When you
Yeah.
bring it that, it's like bringing the emperor's clothes out in the open and saying, that's insane.
Yeah.
How can you do that?
Yeah, I wish I never saw it.
And I'm sitting here and I'm like, I because of my new, I don't know, it's not about me. This interview is about you, right? And and your book and the work you want to do. But I just find the fascinating that it's like I come at this top down and you come at it bottom up, but it's the same problem.
Yeah.
It's the same problem.
Yeah.
It's like, and I'm like in the via negativa, which is we got to have laws to stop the evil. And you're in pedagogical. We got to train people so that they're fit for this high trust society we want to put down. And it's just this really fascinating way of looking at the problem from the two sides that I just think it's really interesting.
I want a body of people that can hold up your body of law.
Yes, exactly. Yes, I see. And I want a body of law that prohibits people from interfering in your way of building people.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, we're really trying hard to capture all of the problems and provide all the solutions from both ends of this thing. That's intentional as well. I mean, that's one of the things I set out to do.
We're trying to fill all the gaps. There's
right.
Gaps, right? I mean,
right. So
all right.
So the next section is captured attention, and it plays into a lot of stuff we've been talking about. So we're not starting from scratch here, right? So, where our society seeks to avoid exposure to fear, because fear is scary, right? People just want to avoid it. It also uses small doses of fear to perpetuate that state of anxiety that can be exploited, right? I mean, what's that the phrase we hear from the news all the time? If it bleeds, it leads, because we look at what scares us, right? So the news leverages that fear response all the time to maintain eyeballs, so they can maintain viewers, so they can keep selling advertisements. The entire attention market is driven off of desire and fear, are the two elements of the attention market. And most of the desire is presented through a mechanism of fear, because it's your lack of it that they're exploiting, your lack of access to it, right?
What's the difference between fear and outrage? Because social media works by outrage.
What's that?
The news works by fear, and social media works by outrage. But isn't it
right? And I would suggest
that thing, though, right?
Yeah, it's the same thing. Outrage is a state of impotence in response to fear.
Yes.
Right. So it's still that failure to successfully navigate fear. It's still an unhealthy relationship with fear. Right. And that doesn't mean it doesn't have a use. And it's not entirely. It's if you have a healthy relationship with fear, then outrage becomes a useful tool for you.
Correct.
Right. Because it can be an encouragement for you to take action or to change decision or viewpoint or things like that. Right. The same thing. One of the coaches I work with, he uses and I just lost the word. Indignation. That's the one I'm talking about, right? Indignation, right? Because you don't want that's the state that he argues for. We want to get in when an attack occurs. Is we want our response to be fueled by indignation. Like, how dare you violate me and my space and my things, right? Yes. And again, that allows us to retake control of those executive functions in the middle of that fear spike, is because we're layering that indignation on top of that response, because it empowers that fear rather than steps us into panic of that fear. It uses that fear as to power our response to the threat, right? So that's what we want to.
What's the one I used? I developed something fairly young. I said, fear to anger, anger to conviction, conviction to plan, plan to execution, execution to completion, to reversal. Right? It's like you don't just sit there and feel. No. You give yourself a pathway through it. And what you're saying is, you're basically doing the same thing. Give yourself the competency to it.
It has to drive action. All of these things have to drive action, or they're undermining us. Right. We're sitting in them, we're spinning in them, we're stewing in them. That's undermining our ability to take action, to make decisions, right, and to be productive. Mm-hmm. Right. So all of these things have to drive action. All of this stuff, everything I'm putting in here, I'm building a bias to act.
Yes.
And that requires the competence and it requires the confidence to step into action. But I'm building a bias to act. All of our decision making is building a bias to act. Right. The whole goal with all of this is to take act to become applied. Right. It can't stay in the theoretical. It has to become applied.
Applied.
Yeah. Right. Because none of the stuff I teach is useful to you if it never gets applied.
That's the same thing as the thing is, there are puzzles when there are problems.
Right.
When you're solving puzzles, it's intellectual self-gratification. I caught myself with the word that time. I didn't first. When you're solving a problem, it's application. It's making a difference in the world.
Yeah. And so, again, back to captured attention. So fear it's a powerful signal response, right? I think we've established that pretty clearly. That response will override our executive functions, right? There's a time and place for that. We want, like I said earlier, we want that to happen. We want the adrenaline spike. We want the cortisol spike. We want the dopamine spike, right? We want some overriding of the executive functions to occur, right? But that also, if we don't have the ability to navigate that, if we never develop the ability to navigate that, that can and does get used to keep our attention on things we otherwise would dismiss as irrelevant to us, right? Like how much, we talk about the news and stuff like that. How much of that outrage is occurring? The person sitting in Tennessee in the United States is outraged about something happening in France. What is that? What bearing does anything happening in France have on the person in Tennessee? And yet their outrage is able to be leveraged and utilized and captured and monetized, right? Just because we can get that in front of them, we can put that in front of them, and because they don't know how to recognize, hey, I'm feeling a spike in my response to this, and is that spike reasonable, rational? Is it productive? Is it doing anything for me? Is there any action I can take here? Right? But nobody has those tools to navigate that, so it just they keep being manipulated by it. That keeps being leveraged against them because we don't provide people the tools to navigate that kind of experience, right? So that we have, that the entire social media industry is built around that phenomenon, right? Where we're outraged about things that have absolutely nothing with our life, nothing at all with our life. We can do nothing about them. There's no action we can take to change them at all. And yet we're sitting in a state of outrage about it. We're sitting in a stage of dread, of depression, of anxiety about these things because we don't have the tools to navigate out of that.
Obviously we like this chapter because we're now an hour and 15 into our usual hour.
Yeah, we chatted about other stuff earlier.
So. Okay, all right. I'm just trying to keep an eye on the ball here.
Yeah.
No, it's more of we like this subject.
Right. Yeah. But people need to understand it. And one of the things I try to present in this captured attention stuff is your eyes are their dollars. Right? Whatever you're paying attention to is what they're making money off of. So they want you just scared enough to keep watching. And if you have
I don't watch TV anymore, but and the only reason I'm on social media is because I need it to work.
Right. But it's not just the TV. Like any bad thing that happens, like school shootings, for example.
Yeah.
Right. That a school shooting in one location should be addressed by what's going on in that location, but it's used to scare everybody in all locations.
Right.
That don't have the conditions that created that thing in that one location, but they're still scared of it in all locations, and it gets used against us all the time, politically, in the news, and in entertainment, in ideologies. They're all using the same dynamic of keep your eyes on me. This is where the source of your fear is, so keep your eyes on me, and I'm going to direct how you respond to that fear, because that makes me a bunch of money and gives me a bunch of power over you, gives me a bunch of control over how you respond and how you act, right? Because you don't know how to do it yourself. So you're dependent on me.
Saying the world isn't a safe place.
The world is not a safe place, and we're terrible at navigating how we respond to that fact that the world is not a safe place when we shouldn't be. We should be absolute experts at navigating fear. We're the world's top adaptive generalists. Our ancestors survived everything that this planet could throw at them, and we've thrived, and we've exerted control over this entire planet.
So can I address an issue this brings up?
Sure.
That when you're going to get eaten by lions and tigers and bears, it's actually real and present. So we keep talking about how crime or our likelihood of encountering violence that's going to kill us has radically decreased over time.
Yes.
But it doesn't mean that the things that threaten us have disappeared. It just means they've shifted in time.
Yes.
Right. So we're killed slowly today.
Yes.
Instead of quickly. And so it's that boiling the frog problem, this destruction of our civilization from within, which of course creates this fear, this creation of anxiety, which produces the mental health issues, which is creating all the suicide and the suicide issues, dissolution of the family, destruction of relationships, and the destruction of our civil commons, or even of our politics and our economy. That's all being destroyed, but you can be killed quickly by something that's obvious or not. The difference is, can you grasp the threat?
Right.
Right. And so there's some of those threats like are easy. I mean, if it's going to eat me, it's a reasonable threat. If the guys from the next hill over are coming with spears, that's a reasonable threat. The problem is you may be weak in those positions, but you have agency.
Right.
So what you're saying is people today are they're not actually the same kind of weak or under the same kind of threat. Right. Well, is that true? It's not true. Right. There's still problems out there. I mean, you look at the woman that went around New York the other day and hit people on the head with a pipe. I don't know how many people she took out before they could find her. It was a lot. Right. Or this random violence, the knockout games, and all this other stuff that's due to internet conflict.
Yes.
The issue of nobody wants me to say this, but the issue of school shootings, well, the schools created the problem that's creating those things. And yet they can't readjust to restoring order and discipline and reciprocal care to bring that about. So is the world safer?
I don't think so.
It's just different.
It's different. There's a different type of threat. But human is the most dangerous animal on the planet.
Yes.
That never stops to be true.
Yes.
Right.
I've had 3 wives. I know this.
Right. Yeah, you have a healthy relationship with fear. You get lots of exposure to it. You get lots of training. So so this idea that there's anything we can actually do to make man completely safe is, again, magical thinking, right? We agree to limits on things that increase the likelihood of safety, but that's only if everybody agrees to them. Right? The moment anyone stops agreeing with that, they become the same threat they were when they were coming over the hill with the spear. Right? I mean, and this one of the things that drives me absolutely bonkers, and it's endemic across the West, but even in the States here, right, is we have this idea that our response to threats is trust the bad guy. Right? Because what do the authorities tell you to do? If somebody comes at you to try to steal something from you, just give it to them. Trust that they won't escalate. Trust that they won't harm you anyways. Just trust the bad guy and do what they say. Don't resist. Don't fight back. Just trust the bad guy. If you're in a physical confrontation with somebody and you're forced to defend yourself, you're the victim of their attack and you're forced to defend yourself. They hit the ground. Everybody wants you to stop your attack and trust that they're not faking. Trust that they can no longer attack. We call it excessive force if you keep unloading into them once they hit the ground. That's absurd. That's trust the bad guy. We shouldn't have a posture of trust the bad guy in our self-preservation in any form, right? But we have that across the board. Like I said, even in places where you can carry a firearm, the guy hits the ground, you're supposed to trust that he's no longer a threat. That's dumb. That's trust the bad guy. Our posture should never be trust the bad guy, but our posture across the West is trust the bad guy.
The problem is this. Yeah, well, the problem is women. Did I say that out loud? But the issue is that there's a difference between a crime of passion and a crime of profit or revenge or politics, right? These are different crimes. Now, if you've got a crime of passion, this is because somebody's basically human and got too far.
Right.
Right. And
They're not navigating their emotions very well.
correct. And so, whereas there are crimes of profit, crimes of intentional harm, crimes of harm by profit, crimes that are basically social, in other words, revolt, and crimes of war, all right, in other words, violence against people, what we call terrorism, right? That spectrum, those people, they don't need a second, they don't need forgiveness. Right. That's not a forgiveness issue. I can lose my temper. I got pretty control of it, but I could lose my temper and do.
Mhm.
I hit somebody too hard once, right? I mean, it's possible, right? And you get older, it's easier to regulate it. But when you're young and you're fit and you got a lot of testosterone, putting a damper on that thing is like, it requires quite a bit of self-regulation.
Right.
Right. I mean, you walk in on somebody messing with your wife. I mean, it, you get insulted when you're under the influence of alcohol, right? I mean, these are just stupidity of being human, right? I mean, that's one thing where you say, okay, we got it. We got the situation calmed down. But anything beyond that, that's not a crime of passion. Right. That's something that needs to be put down.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, did I take you too far off?
No, you're fine. You're fine. No, and but it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. The mechanisms in place that produce a high trust society. When they're there, it makes some sense to trust the restraint of the bad guy, right? Because you have all these mechanisms in place of high trust. But as soon as those are gone, then any notion of trust the bad guy should disappear rationally, right? I mean, because all of those mechanisms are gone. I don't know. It's one of those pet peeves of mine when just our whole approach is so centered around trust the bad guy. It's just so disarming of the victims of attacks when our entire legal system supports trust the bad guy as the default state of processing these things after they happen, right?
Well, there's a problem with empathizing over systematizing, right? I mean, we have a group of people that can't technically it's a category of solipsism, right?
Right.
It's one step away from psychosis.
Right.
Right. Which is you're empathizing with the person, though you have no reason to.
Right. Yeah.
And you wouldn't if you were the victim.
Right. And I think, and just to tie that back into the work, a lot of that I think can be ameliorated by developing, in training, kids and whatnot, developing a healthy relationship with fear and a healthy awareness of fear. It tempers that empathy when people are capable of recognizing threats.
That's probably the core problem that's probably the core problem of re-education.
Yes.
Which is if you're empathizing, do the reversal game.
Yep.
Right. I mean, if you were attacked, would you empathize?
Yes.
Right. But it's also to distinguish between what's empathizing, which is crimes of passion.
Right.
And what's not empathizing, crimes of aggression.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, and that's what again, I know it's a lot of it was good intention, but that's what all of this, let's avoid any experience of fear has cost us. It's allowed that over empathization to develop. It's allowed that dysfunction of
remember what over empathization is. It's evasion of responsibility.
Right. Yeah. But that's the thing. People that can't navigate fear they're incapable of responsibility.
Right.
That's why this stuff is so foundational. This is so it impacts our ability to express as functional humans. This stuff, and that's why losing this is so terrible for us. And I get the world feels like a much safer place. So yeah, we should be able to ignore some of the stuff. We can't because it inhibits our ability to express as functional humans. Right? This is foundational to us being cooperative apes.
I got a lot out of this conversation, but I got to tell you, it's somewhat exasperating.
Yeah. Well, and that's why it's exasperating for me too, only because I see so many people putting so much effort into solving the effects
wrong
of these
problem.
things rather than digging down deep enough to find the underlying cause.
Yes.
And it's like, guys, just join me in this underlying cause. Let's
Yeah.
let's teach people what.
How could this be brought to? I'm sorry, I keep fucking interrupting you. You know
No,
why
it's
I'm
good. It's
interrupting
good.
you?
That's
I'm
why
interrupting you because I'm so engaged and excited by what you're saying that I can't stop my thoughts running in my head
yeah.
with all the ideas you're giving me. So
Yeah.
how would you take this to the school environment? That would be fascinating.
Yes.
That would be fascinating.
Well, and one of the things I'm doing personally, just because I teach this stuff and stuff like that, is I actually am I'm doing some experiments with teaching this to the homeschool groups I'm associated with and my kids are associated with. Because I want to explore, how do I present this to younger and younger audiences, and how do I explore this to their parents and equip their parents with continuing to teach them this stuff, right? So I'm doing a lot of that.
Gets a
Oh.
child out of being self-absorbed.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, how they get, because it's the tendency of a child in the absence of stress is self-absorption.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. But external is right. I mean,
well, it's, so many, and I understand it. I understand that the reason for it, but so many parents, they want to remove the potential of the negative experiences for their children, rather than partner with their children in learning how to navigate those negative experiences. Right? It's like, don't let them watch the bad movies, don't let them read the bad books, don't let them experience, pretend like there aren't bad people out there, right? Whereas my approach is very right. My approach is very different to that, right? It's like, yeah, I'll read the book first before I let my kids read it to make sure it's context appropriate for them. But then we'll sit and read it together, and I will be on hand, and we will explore the topics in it, and I'll help them navigate what comes up for them as they go through that material, whether it's fear, whether it's anger, whether it's sadness, whether it's any of these emotions, right? It's an active process of my engagement in their development as functional humans. And we just don't do that at the schooling level, right? We just don't expose kids to that, right? It's a challenge to navigate them through that, right? You have to know the kids well enough to know how they're going to respond and stuff like that. So it's a hard thing, but it's still, we have enough resources and technology where we should be much better at it than we currently are.
If you're taught about, I only know this because I learned from having daughters and son, right? That the way you talk to your daughter is different from the way you talk to your son. Right? My son is so easy. Right. It's just the tone of voice and the brevity of what you say and the physical manifestation of your being.
Right.
Right. With daughters, it's partly that, but it's also, I heard you.
Yes.
Right. It's also, I heard you, I understand, but this is the way it's got to be, right? With the boys, they're just like, yeah, I understand. But your daughter's got to they hear you. So it'd be interesting to see what happened if you got some manly men who were not full of nonsense and prevarication, who were just reality based, just to teach this to kids. How young can you teach it? It would seem like pretty young.
Yeah, I don't know. Like I said, I'm just getting started with those experiments. The youngest kid I have access to consistently right now through the families that we interact with is 2 to 3, and that's probably a little early for this material.
Yes.
You got to be about 5 before you even recognize that other people have different thoughts than you.
Yes.
Right? I mean, that's kind of the developmental barrier right there, is that 5-year-old, in order to even recognize that there's a thing called an external. Yeah.
The 6-7 range.
Yep. Now, that said, I want the younger ones mimicking their parents in this process, so that there's already building foundation of behavior behind this stuff.
So you got to train the parents so they continue to
right. Exactly. So yeah, it's a big thorny problem.
Any problem, the hard part of the problem is understanding it. The rest of it's just work.
Right.
I mean, what you're talking about is it's hard to do the work. Well, yeah, that's hard to do the work. It's hard to organize the work. It's hard to institutionalize the work.
Yeah.
But it's that's not really, that's just work to make that happen. The problem is, what's causing this catastrophe that we're living through?
Right. Yeah. Then we're working with this stuff specifically. We're working against people's blissful ignorance, right? Because they're walking around tripping daisies. They don't want to know that all the bad things are out there and that they can learn to navigate them, right? So there's this whole, we have to get over that initial hump of
All right, they
I-
don't
I
want
get
responsibility. They don't
Right.
want the responsibility.
right,
Right.
right. Whereas if they just grew up with this stuff, that wouldn't even be a factor.
Yeah.
They wouldn't have the resistance to that because they wouldn't have the fear of it, because they have a healthy way to navigate their experience of fear. Right.
Now,
So-
I'm just old enough to remember, you probably are too. I'm just old enough to remember what it was like for farm workers who worked on a farm and what that life was like, right? Those men worked for a effing living. I mean, they worked, right? There were still, I mean, when I was in my teens, there were still men who worked cutting stonemasons in the UK.
Right.
You could go visit them, right? But I was at a place yesterday, and the owner of the shop said, the kids don't know how to work. And it's that they don't know how to be responsible.
Right.
Right? They don't have a need to be responsible. They don't know how to be responsible, so they don't work to satisfy responsibility.
Right. Right. And we can't just teach them responsibility. They have to have something in place to support the development of responsibility. Right. And my argument is fear, being able to navigate fear is one of those things that have to have in place in order to build the competence of responsibility. So, which just makes the problem deeper and harder to solve, but that's what we do, right? So I want to go over this one point again before we move on to the next section, just because it's important. So I want to bring it up again, right? This social media, right? That's where false fear became a worldwide pastime, right? We talk about the outrage and stuff, right? And so through social media, anyone can capture attention with false fear signals, right? It's not just limited to the news media or anything like that. Anyone can do it, right? Now, my argument is that we ought to be mature enough to dismiss a story of a terrible thing that happened 10 states away as having nothing to do with us, right? We ought to be responsible enough to recognize we have no way to interact with that, intercede with that, right? But because social media erases proximity, and that's the important part here, social media erases proximity, and because fear bypasses executive function, every story, no matter how distant, becomes something we must pay attention to. Our fear forces us to it. Our inability to navigate fear forces us to pay attention to it, and social media erases proximity, and that's the big danger of those two elements working together.
It assists in coalescence.
Yeah,
I always think social media takes you out of punch in the face range.
Right. Yeah, which is
the end of civility.
Right.
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 I mean,
right.
if you're out of punch in the face range, you're that's the end of civility.
But from the standpoint of supporting cooperation, because of this dynamic in play, right? Everything becomes something we have to weigh in on. Something we must turn into a national or even international event, or some sort of awareness. We all have to have an opinion about all this stuff, right? And that's just again, it's because we aren't mature enough to recognize our distance from these things. All of these things are compromising and undermining our ability to cooperate with each other.
My grandmother said it was a generation. I remember these little old ladies. They would say, "I don't know about such things." They would just not give you an opinion,
right?
Because they say, "I don't know." But you ask
right.
the other generations, they got an effing opinion. Like
and that's such a responsible response, right? That's such a responsible response to truly not have.
I know a lot of stuff, right? I mean, right. And people ask me today, it's not uncommon for me to say, I don't know.
Right. Yes.
Right. I mean, I would say, I just don't know. Right. I mean,
I have nothing.
I don't have enough knowledge to comment.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
I mean, but why is that so unique? You say, I don't. You could say, for what little I understand.
Right.
Which is probably what my father's generation would have said. From what little I understand, it's probably something like this. But confidence and ignorance is just beyond my comprehension.
Right. Or describe it to me and I'll tell you what I feel about or how I think about your description. Right.
Right.
We go from that angle. But yeah, the ability to just recognize your own limits is hugely important. But people are scared of that. I don't want to admit to having limits.
And to be less self-absorbed. Right. You don't even have to be compassionate. You just have to not assume that you're blithering. It makes any sense.
Right. Yeah. So, so that whole section, right? The gist of that whole section is that we've become terrible at fear and we're getting worse at it. And so the problems are going to continue to multiply if we don't change that. If we don't step in and figure out a way to address that. Right. So the next section is the world is not a safe place. Right. There are legitimate things out there to be afraid of. And most of them are far closer than what people are paying attention to. like the knockout games and the mugger and stuff like that, right? The actual violence. I'm not talking about the douchebag fights in the bar. That's all posturing. I'm talking about actual violence where somebody's coming after you for your body, your property, or your life. Actual violence, right? And that's much closer than we're paying attention to, right? Because we're so distracted, we're so triggered by the fear being used to manipulate us that we're not actually paying attention to the fear that ought to be triggering us into action. Right. And that's again, the big distinction I make here is if it's not triggering you into action, it's not a fear signal. It's a fear emotion, it's a fear projection, but it's not a fear signal, right? So readjust, readapt. In fact, we live in an exceedingly dangerous reality, right? Not just from the world's deadliest creature, man, but from our environment, right? All this stuff that we dismissed. We talked in the last session about the crane falling down and stuff like that, right? We're surrounded by dangers, right? Those cars whipping by us are hugely dangerous to us. The drivers are not paying attention. They're on their phones. They're not, most of them shouldn't be licensed drivers, right? But we're not even paying attention to the threat that presents to us, right? So all of these,
you can live in the ex-Soviet space,
right,
and walk around with a telephone on your ear. It's like, please kill me.
Right. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I just can't understand it. Right. I mean, I sort of get like walking down Fifth Avenue with the headphones on. Right. I mean, because it's pretty dense with population and sort of whatever. But any time where you're actually vulnerable because there's no insulation from others around you, like, the guy who walked, just happened again the other day, walking down the railroad tracks with the fucking headphones on, right? He gets hit by the train and he turns into human pizza.
Right.
Right. I mean, that's just be situationally aware.
Right. Right. Well,
I recognize some people can't drive very well, right? I mean, right. But it's the same thing with motorcyclists. I'm like, drive paranoid. I mean, it's not complicated. And just assume you're invisible and everybody's accidentally going to try to kill you.
Right.
Right. I mean, it's just situational awareness.
Yes.
And
yes.
you wonder,
not even intentional.
Sorry, I want to just finish this one last blip, which is that, you wonder why IQ has such an effect on health and fitness.
Right.
It's because you're spending more of your IQ points with situational awareness with less effort.
Yes.
Right. It's not rocket science why they ask you in your insurance whether you have an education or not.
Right.
Because it basically means you're more situationally aware.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, it's good. It's good.
I feel like I'm out here a preacher. Luke's given me a Bible and I can preach from it.
Well, that's the big takeaway is that no matter what we do, the world is not going to become a safe place. There's no magic wand we can wave to make the world a safe place, right? And so focusing all of our efforts on trying to make things safe is never going to achieve safety for us in the way that we hope it will, right? We have to develop the tools to safely navigate the dangers that exist, right? As they present themselves to us. Now,
maneuver, what is it? Attack, defense, and you have the three choices: attack, defense, and maneuver.
Right.
Maneuver is the optimum solution.
Yes, absolutely. We talk about diffusing situations before they happen. Distance diffuses, right? That's always the option. Yes. Distance is the best option to pick for safety, I think. Right. So the world's not a safe place. We have to learn to navigate the danger. The first step in being able to do that, before you can learn to navigate, before you can develop safety, your own safety, the only safety you ever actually have is the one you carry with you. Before you can develop that, you have to learn how to be afraid. You have to learn fear.
Yes.
Because that tells you what to safely navigate.
Yes.
Right? They go hand in hand. You can't develop your own safety. You can't you can't create the confidence to safely navigate your environment without fear.
You can't develop that without awareness.
Right. And even the awareness is triggered by the fear. I mean, fear is so essential to our successful navigation of our environment. I mean, it's just, we can't keep neglecting it. We can't keep leaving it off the table. We can't keep pretending like it's not a thing we have to have.
I loved every chapter, but I really love this one. All right, what's next?
So I finish up the end of the chapter is I introduce this idea that courage is not the opposite of fear, and fear is not the opposite of courage. Right. And so we hear this often, right? That fear is the opposite of courage, right? But I don't think that's even possible because, as we discussed with things like outrage and with things like, the other experiences of fear that we talked about, anger and things like that, fear can actually encourage when we have a healthy relationship to it.
Yeah, of course.
It can trigger us into action. So fear can't be the opposite of courage if it can produce courage, right? It can't be its opposite, right? So from my perspective, the opposite of courage is discouraged. That's what I
Brilliant.
would consider the opposite.
Discouraging demoralization.
Right. Discouraging, demoralization, resentment, depression, anxiety. These are all things that manifest in the discouraged and the people that don't have access to the healthy navigation of courage. Right. That's where these things grow. That's where these dysfunctions bear fruit. Right. It's in the discouraged.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So all the systems I hope to help people escape use discouragement to hold people dependent. Right. They want you to need the grocery store. They want you to need to rely on them for your safety. They want you to need
effing evil. It's evil. I mean, I have a bad enough time as it is.
Yeah. It's definitely sinister. Even if we remove
sinister
the intent from it, the fact that we allow it to persist is sinister. It's destroying us. And the fix, this is one of those, pat myself on the back. So the fix here is so simple. There's just a few things we got to learn, right? It doesn't mean they're easy to learn, but there's just a few things we got to learn to have in place the tool set we need to not let this happen, to avoid this happening to us, right? Mm-hmm. So that's, I don't know. but the big thing is, it's that discourage that I want people aware of, right? So these systems that are using it against us, right? They rely on these states of emotional collapse, of demoralization, of resentment, depression, anxiety. They rely on them so that they can act as your provider. They're the means by which you navigate reality. They're the means by which you navigate your fear. Trust in them. They will get you there. They will solve the fear trigger for you. That's what every politician is promising, is to solve your fear issues for you, right? Rather than, I will teach you how to navigate your fear. You're never going to hear a politician say that, right? So I also,
they can't get your attention for, we're trying to figure out if we should add extra $3 billion to the budget for the blah, 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 blah.
Right.
Who's going to, if you want to be that bored, you go to your local government, right? Because that's mostly what happens there is the stuff that actually matters, which is how many taxes you're going to pay for what improvement to your society.
Right. Yeah. And so I also, in this section, right, so because we're talking about discourage, and I'm introducing the topic of discourage, and I want people to really understand what this means. I show the reader how the contemporary expressions, the contemporary concepts of oppression and privilege are actually derivatives of this dysfunctional relationship with fear from the perspective of this discouraged state, right? So the people that are disconnected, that can't recognize the source of their discouragement, they can't recognize what's keeping them demoralized, what's keeping them resentful, right? They're expressing that disconnect as a feeling of oppression, right? Their experience of that is something is preventing me from expressing myself fully, right? This state of discouragement is this state, this being demoralized, it's being resentment. There has to be something that's doing that to me. And that's what there's this notion of oppression is emerging out of. And really, it all just comes back to they never learned how to navigate. Nobody ever taught them how to navigate, how to build a healthy relationship with fear, right? So it manifests as this notion, this idea of oppression. And then the opposite, that notion of privilege, comes from that same place. They're looking at people that are navigating fear, that have a healthy relationship with fear, that can accurately interpret those fear signals, looking at those people going, it's not possible, it's not physically possible for them to be navigating the world like that. They can't even comprehend how they can be navigating the world like that. So it has to come from some form of privilege. They have to have access to something I don't have access to. And they do, but it's not a physical thing they have access to. It's not a tangible thing they have access to. They have access to, they're able to competently navigate fear. They're able to competently navigate the expression of fear triggers, the signals. They recognize the fear signals, right? So, but for people that don't have that, they look at this and they feel themselves oppressed, and they feel everybody else that can do these things as privileged, right? And they can't get past that.
That's so explanatory power. Of course, I'm trying not to interrupt you, but I'm running away with this explanatory power of what you're saying, which is the creation of fragility instead of fragility, the creation of adaptability instead of maladaptivity.
and how did you put it? The creation of discouragement and demoralization instead of courage and conviction. And then what is the one you just brought up?
The oppression and privilege.
Right, and then the oppression versus privilege. These are all manifestations of failure of institutions to prepare people for life in modernity.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. We're not integrated. We've dismissed all of the things that we require, and because of that dismissal, we can't integrate them into this progress that we've achieved. This technological progress, this social progress, all of these things that we celebrate. We're not integrating these core human competencies into those things because we've left them behind instead of bringing them with us and integrating them into how we continue to move forward as humans. Right? It's because we're cut off from that. We're becoming something less than human is what's happening.
Just love the frame that you've produced here for talking about this. It's wonderful.
Right.
Okay. So are we done?
Yeah, I mean that's where I finished the book because I want people to
Summarize. You
recognize.
got to say your last sentence here because it summarizes.
Yeah. So I talk a lot about dependence, and so I just want to throw this in before we get there. Right. So the discouraged are those that are dependent on others for navigating the triggers of their fear response, and any need that you risk going without is going to trigger a fear response. Right. So all the stuff in the book that I talk about, all the needs that I talk about in the book are tied into this fear response. Because anytime your needs aren't met, you're going to be fearful, right? So developing your own ability to navigate those fears, learning the situational awareness, learning how to accurately assess threats, it replaces that dread and that discouragement with competence and confidence, right? So it's turning fear back into a powerful signal that sends you into action when an immediate threat emerges or even a long-term threat emerges. You get better and better at recognizing all forms of threat, all the things that are hostile to you, and you can be responsible, right? But all these things that emerge in your environment, right? So because of that, courage is the confidence of competence in the navigation of fear, right? So that competence provides you the foundation of courage so that you can build that healthy relationship with fear, right? And interpret all of these things correctly and be responsible and cooperate with others. And it's I don't know, it's kind of the root of all evil.
Wonderful. All right. So did we accomplish in this discussion what you, and this is a 2 hour, it's not because the timer's been going on since we started the meeting, right?
Right.
So
yeah.
it's an hour, it's probably an hour and a half. Right?
Yeah. It's a longer one, but this is an important topic.
It's a great topic. So did we get across what you wanted to?
Yeah. I set out this the intent of this chapter is for people to stop being afraid of fear. And I think we've done a good job, in our interactions here of communicating the value of fear to us as a tool and the essential requirement of fear as part of our ability to navigate the world. So a lot of people wouldn't realize it, but we have to have fear in order to cooperate with each other.
Yeah, but fear, the human fear response, which is up here, right? It's like the interrupt on a computer. Yep. It says, "Hey, I got your attention.
Yep.
I'm taking it."
Yep.
Right. It's like if you get burned, it's like, I'm taking it. You don't get a chance. Right. There are certain kinds of fears. I'm taking it. The problem is you want to be conscious enough of your environment that there's a few surprises as necessary, so you can maneuver to act to avoid them if necessary.
Yep.
But you want to practice this often enough that it becomes autonomic, so you don't really think about it, because I don't, right? We talked before. And then what you want to do is when those interrupts come, you want to evaluate them.
Right.
And you want to respond accordingly instead of respond sometimes instinctually, which may be to freeze or maybe to run when you ought to just handle something or whatever.
Great. Yeah.
So what I like about what you're saying is this development of the competency that produces the agency, that produces the confidence to be aware of your environment and have the peace of mind to react to it accordingly. I think that's awesome. Yeah. So anyway, conscious of our time, is there anything you want to close with?
Nope, I think we achieved what we were hoping to achieve. You know, I think
I had a
I think it's clear
blast.
to anyone watching that I think fear is very important. I think
Yes,
being able to build a healthy relationship with fear is very important,
yes.
essential to us being
Don't
productive
want to
human beings.
remove fear. We want to teach how to to deal with it.
Yes, and the better we get at you know, threat identification and navigating fear, so it actually helps us learn how to do all the other emotions as well, how to
Right.
navigate even the positive
It's
experiences.
the foundation of bunch
Right.
all
So, I
mindfulness
mean,
is created.
you know, the way we evolve is we solve, keep us alive first, then we start solving for everything else based on how effective that keep us alive part worked.
Yes.
And fear is essential to that keep us alive first part. So
All right, Luke Weinhagen, author, brilliant man, the Primal Primer. You can get it where, Luke?
Amazon, Barnes and Noble's web store, any online bookseller is going to have it. You can find also links to like the audiobook and video books through my website, corehumancompetence.com. That's also if you want to get classes and stuff, that's where you go to reach me. So
All right, Proth. So I had blast in this one again. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for doing this. What's chapter 16, which is I think the last, right?
Yep, chapter 16 is the end of the book, the closing chapter. It's where I sum everything up. It's called We Are All Mice Now, Core Human Competence in Our Postmodern Dystopia. That's what we
Mice now?
Yeah.
I'm glad you chose mice instead of rats.
Well, rats, I think, offer a little more something to be afraid of.
Yes.
We've become mice.
Mice are cute. All right.
Right.
All right. So if you want to end this recording, I'd still like to talk to you for a minute
Sure.
afterwards. And I'm Kurt Doolittle from the Natural Law Institute. This is Luke Weinhagen from the Institute. From what's your company again?
Core Human Competence.
Core Human Competency, and author of the Primal Primer. Please leave your likes, subscribe, comment, whatever you may, so that we can know you enjoyed this as much as we did.
Absolutely. Thank you.